Hello, I'm Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer. It's pouring with rain outside and I've been unable to get out and do a proper walk or some filming in the usual way. So I've come and taken sanctuary in my studio here. However, I have been out with my stills camera and taken some pictures for today's video because I want to look at the landscape of a town. And I'm just looking at the landscape of Worthing in West Sussex down on the south coast where I live. And I'm aware that the town that I've lived in for the last 28 years has changed so much. And it's been changing really since the Victorian era, although I guess, you could say that towns have changed when the Victorians came in, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So this is a seaside town. We have a pier, we have a beach, and you would imagine that a seaside town, like so many of those, perhaps you've seen them in Cornwall, have that seaside look and feel. And in fact, that's in the early days of the Edwardian times when the town really came into its own and was being promoted so that we could have day trippers down here to come and sample the sea and sit on the beach and have that lovely sea air coming in. These were important features that people would want to promote to the town to bring a little bit of tourism and some prosperity and work to the shopkeepers who were here. Well, I don't know that that's really what people are promoting for this seaside town now, because when you walk around, what you start to see is very strange changes. So we have an Edwardian town principally. We also have Victorian buildings. The Victorians did a lot of extensive building in Worthing. And then in the 1920s, 30s, there was quite a bit of Art Deco in there. Then of course we went into the war and things changed after that. We had to replace buildings that might have been damaged in the war from bombs. Bombs did land, but not as much as you might not, nothing like the Blitz in London or in some of the towns that were looked up in the Baedeker guidebooks, such as Exeter, where the Germans came in and they targeted those towns to try and raze them to the ground, or Coventry, that sort of thing. But after the war, we had the brutality of architecture in the 60s, and we had a great razing to the ground, worse in fact than the Second World War and our enemies, by the councils in the 1960s, where they did away with some of the older, what they thought was old-fashioned and unwanted, and we were now going into this new world. Well, I guess that would be okay if there had been some thought and plan behind it, but the 60s architecture was quite brutalist, I think a lot of it was, and was quite ugly. We do seem to now have recognised that and are doing away with some of these awful multi-storey car parks and tower blocks which were made of cement and just pretty abysmal to look at. But what are we replacing them with? And this is where I think the argument for thinking about our heritage and the landscape that we live in. I think the landscape that we live in is incredibly important, and it needs to reflect its heritage and its position in the world. There are going up now cheap accommodation, flats, 1-bedroom flats, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, social housing, and more expensive in the centre of Worthing, which I just think are inappropriate. They're bland. They just look out of place. It's very stark and peculiar that they're even here. And when you start to put in very odd buildings into an environment that once had a very clear identity, you lose that identity, and also a lot of the dignity has been lost. So let's go back to those Victorians. Of course, the Victorians were able to build extensively over from, I guess, the 1840s up until the turn of the century at 1900, because they had started to put in railways, and the railway lines meant that you could move materials for building a lot easier and quicker. So you could have a manufacturing base somewhere else. We had the Industrial Revolution, and you could bring your piles of bricks from wherever into a town and build very rapidly, and they did. And you could argue that back then the Victorians changed the face of the towns and countries, which I guess to a certain degree is absolutely true. I mean, you go back to the Tudor period, you see these wonderful timber frame buildings. Many of those are all gone now, but there are a few that are still remaining that are sort of 600 years old. In the Georgian period, you had a very distinctive style that came about, and then in the Victorian period, another style. And but the one thing the Victorians did, although they started to encroach in a lot of land, and I've been looking at the land grab in recent times. I visited my hometown, you may remember, in one of my videos, and was astonished how the farm behind me had absolutely vanished and had this very modernistic theme park type buildings built, which were completely unaffordable for most people and almost became a bit of a ghetto for the rich. And so I've been looking at that, but the Victorians, you know, you could, as I said before, you could argue that they did exactly the same. But at least with the Victorians, the houses that they built were spacious, a lot more spacious than some of these modern houses, which are supposedly giving equivalent families the opportunity to buy bigger rooms, taller ceilings, well built. I mean, my house is over 130 odd years old, and substantially there's very little wrong with it. I've got a little hole in the roof now, but 130 something years later, some of these anomalies are coming up. And the Victorians gave you gardens. There was dignity and respectability. Now, admittedly, you look at some of the pictures, a number of these buildings which are now owned by the middle classes or the upper middle classes, were originally slums. And yes, there were lots of people to one room. There was barely any furniture. There was hardly any decor. People weren't earning a lot of money, but they did have a roof over their head, and they had a sense of pride. And now what we're seeing is these different strange buildings that are coming up that seem inappropriate and have no sensitivity to the location that they're in, which is a great shame. And you see that with the new builds, that they're rising overnight without the infrastructure that the Victorians had originally put in, with corner shops and pubs and churches and all of that. And I feel that now, unfortunately for Worthing, it's lost its character. Where it had been this seaside town that people would come down to and day trip to, have a look at the steam ships and that go on the pier and stroll on the promenade and go and look at the shops and take in the air. Now we have this mishmash of buildings that really and truly could be anywhere. J.B. Priestley, back in the 30s, was concerned about this. He was driving into Southampton, I think it was, and he looked about him at the little shops and the rows of houses. These are the Victorian houses. And he exclaimed that, well, I could be anywhere. I could be in Carlisle, because, and that's at the opposite end of the country for those that don't know, and it could be anywhere. And this, I feel, is happening more and more, that over the last 100 years this is so much happening. I mean, you look at some of the style of the new builds that are going up, and the flats and the cheaper accommodation. You've got this weird juxtaposition between these wonderful Victorian properties, which have been, over the time, have weathered well. They have been individually painted or made unique and characterful, and then these almost cookie cutter, computer generated bland boxes, which have just, it looks like from space, some of them have just been plonked in here. And you think, well, I could be anywhere. I could be in an urban city somewhere, not by the seaside in a lovely English county. And to me, that seems a shame. And we're in this world, and it's almost as if nobody cares anymore. Nobody cares that we have a certain character to our towns and our villages that are sensitive and appropriate to the place that we live. Be interested in your thoughts. I know there'll be plenty of people who completely disagree with me and say, oh, Richard, but you're just nostalgic, and it's, we have to progress. But I would just ask, this business about progression, that we've always got to progress, where are we progressing to? Where is it going? What is the plan? We're told that we've got to keep having this progression, but nobody tells me where this progression is leading us to. And when I look around at the weird collection of buildings that we've got, I hold my head in shame. Don't forget to follow, like and subscribe, become a patron, give me a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it, but leave a comment and tell me what you think. I may be completely wrong, I may be an old dinosaur, so I'll be interested in what you think of the world around you and the appropriateness or not of the buildings in the landscape. Till next time, thanks for watching, bye bye.